In 1921, deep inside a lead and zinc mine in what was then called Broken Hill in northern Rhodesia, a place that would become the town of Kabwe in the independent nation of Zambia, a Swiss miner named Tom Zwiglar was working through limestone cave deposits when his tools struck something that was not ore. It was a skull, nearly complete, extraordinarily preserved. The brow ridges were massive, jutting forward from the face with a thickness and solidity that looked almost architectural. The brain case was low and elongated, the face broad and heavily built, the bone dense with the weight of something ancient, in a way that the miner, whose job was to extract metal and not to think about prehistory, could only have recognized as strange. He brought it out of the earth and handed it to mining officials, who sent it to the British Museum. Specifically, they sent it to Arthur Smith Woodward, one of the leading paleoanthropologists of the era. Woodward looked at what had been pulled from the ground in the middle of Africa and did what scientists of his era typically did when confronted with something they could not immediately place. He assigned it a name. He called it Homo rhodesiensis, Rhodesian man, and classified it as the type specimen of an entirely new species. And in doing so, he set in motion a century of argument about who this individual was, when it had lived, how it related to modern humans, and what its existence implied about the story we tell ourselves about where our species began. That argument is not finished. In some ways, it has barely started, because the Kabwe skull, as it is now properly known, has accumulated mysteries faster than science has been able to resolve them. And the most important of those mysteries is one that a 2020 study published in the journal Nature finally addressed, and in addressing it, produced a finding that reshaped the entire landscape of human evolutionary science in a way that the field is still working through. The mystery was its age. For most of the 20th century, scientists estimated the Kabwe skull to be somewhere around 500,000 years old. Some estimates put it older, some put it younger. Without precise dating, which was impossible for most of the century because the original cave site had been completely quarried away by mining operations, destroying the geological context that would have allowed conventional dating methods, the number remained a rough consensus, a placeholder, a best guess that the field operated with because it had no better option. In the years before the 2020 study, some researchers placed the skull as young as 125,000 years old. Others held to the 500,000-year estimate. The uncertainty was enormous, and it mattered enormously, because where you place the Kabwe skull in time determines what role it could have played in the story of human evolution. A 500,000-year-old skull could plausibly sit in the ancestral line that eventually produced Homo sapiens. A 300,000-year-old skull is contemporaneous with the earliest known Homo sapiens fossils, which are themselves dated to approximately 300,000 years ago from a site called Jebel Irhoud in Morocco. And that changes everything. The 2020 study, led by geochronologist Rainer Grun of Griffith University in Australia and published in Nature, applied two sophisticated direct dating techniques to the skull itself. Electron spin resonance dating and uranium series analysis were conducted on small samples taken directly from the fossil. The two methods independently converged on a result, a best age estimate of 299,000 years, plus or minus 25,000 years. This was not a number extracted from the surrounding sediment or inferred from associated artifacts. It was derived from the bone itself, from the physical chemistry of what had happened to that calcium and uranium over the centuries, and it carried a precision that no previous estimate had been able to achieve. 300,000 years old, not 500,000, not 125,000. Contemporary with the very first anatomically modern humans that the fossil record has produced anywhere on Earth, the implication landed in the scientific community like a stone dropped into still water. Because if the Kabwe skull dates to approximately 300,000 years ago, then the individual it belonged to was not an ancestor of Homo sapiens in the straightforward sense that the field had previously assumed. It was a contemporary, a neighbor, a member of a different human species living on the same continent at the same time as the earliest people who could be meaningfully called our own kind. Anthropologist Chris Stringer of the Natural History Museum in London, who has spent decades studying the Kabwe skull and human evolution more broadly, drew out the implication with characteristic directness. The new age estimate, he said, indicates that at least 3 distinct human species inhabited the African continent approximately 300,000 years ago simultaneously. Homo sapiens, appearing in places like Morocco and Ethiopia. Homo heidelbergensis, the species to which the Kabwe skull is now most commonly assigned, living in south-central Africa. And Homo naledi, a small-brained, primitive-featured hominin discovered in 2013 in the Rising Star cave system outside Johannesburg in South Africa, dated to between 236,000 and 335,000 years ago. 3 separate human lineages, 1 continent, 1 geological moment in deep time. That is not the story that most people were taught about where we came from. The standard narrative, the one that dominated paleoanthropology for most of the second half of the 20th century, is called the single origin or out of Africa model. In its strongest form, it holds that Homo sapiens evolved from a single population in a specific region of Africa, and that this ancestral population then spread outward across the continent and eventually out of Africa entirely, replacing the archaic human populations that had previously occupied Eurasia. It is a clean story. It has a clear center of origin, a directional movement, and a decisive outcome. It is also the story that the genetic evidence, particularly the work done in the 1980s and 1990s on mitochondrial DNA, which traced all living human lineages back to a common female ancestor in Africa roughly 150,000 to 200,000 years ago, seem to confirm. But the Kabwe skull at 300,000 years old does not fit comfortably inside that clean story. Neither does the broader picture that paleoanthropology has been assembling over the past decade, piece by piece, through a combination of new fossil discoveries, better dating technologies, and the expanding reach of ancient DNA analysis. The skull itself is physically extraordinary beyond its age. The Smithsonian's Human Origins program describes it as having features similar to Homo erectus: a low braincase profile toward the back of the skull, large brow ridges more prominent than those of any living human, a slight widening of the midface known as the sagittal keel, and a protrusion at the back of the skull called the occipital torus. But it also has features that look more modern. The upper face, around the nose and cheekbones, is relatively graceful. The dental structure has been studied for evidence of health and disease, and what the studies found there added a layer of unexpected intimacy to the antiquity of this individual. The teeth show extensive dental cavities. The Kabwe individual had terrible tooth decay across multiple teeth, a pattern that, in modern populations, is associated with a high carbohydrate diet. And that represents one of the most human and unglamorous biological records to survive 300,000 years in the African ground. But it is the hole in the skull that has generated the most extraordinary and most contested attention across the centuries since its discovery. On the left side of the cranium, there's a small, perfectly round hole approximately 8 millimeters in diameter. The edges are clean. There are none of the radial stress fractures or bone spalling that would typically result from a cold projectile, such as a stone-tipped spear or an arrow. On the opposite side of the skull, the parietal bone is shattered, as though something had passed through the skull from left to right with enough force and velocity to explode the exit point outward. The combination of a clean entry wound and a shattered exit wound is, as forensic scientists have noted when asked about it, consistent with a high-velocity penetrating object, the kind produced by a firearm. This observation has been the starting point for decades of fringe speculation, none of which the established scientific community treats seriously. The claim that a 300,000-year-old skull from Zambia was shot by a modern bullet has circulated in alternative history communities for years, accompanied by suggestions ranging from time travel to extraterrestrial intervention. The mainstream scientific response is that the hole is almost certainly a healed or partially healed pathological lesion, a bone abnormality, a tumor, or the result of a chronic infection that had been eating through the cranial bone at the time of death. Similar lesions have been documented in other fossil hominins. The clean edges are consistent with a slow biological process, rather than a violent mechanical one. The shattered opposite side may have occurred post-mortem, as the skull underwent the pressures of burial and fossilization over 300 millennia, but the whole remains unexplained with complete certainty. The mainstream explanation is plausible, it is not proven, and the skull itself, sitting in a drawer at the Natural History Museum in London, where it has lived since mining officials shipped it out of Africa in 1921, cannot speak to settle the question. That location and the politics of it is a story running parallel to the scientific one, and it is a story that has been building pressure for 50 years. Zambia achieved independence from Britain in 1964. A decade later, in 1974, the newly established National Monuments Commission wrote formally to the British Museum, requesting information about the circumstances under which the skull had left the country, and asking for its return. The British Museum responded that the Broken Hill Development Company had donated the skull to the museum, and that the British Museum Act of 1963 forbade the museum's trustees from disposing of any museum material. Zambia's request was, in effect, refused before it was fully considered. In 1978, the Zambian ambassador to England raised the issue again. Nothing substantive changed. Through the 1980s and 1990s, through international conventions and UNESCO frameworks that Britain consistently declined to ratify, the skull remained in London. In 2018, at the 21st session of the UNESCO Intergovernmental Committee, Zambia made its case before an international audience. Collins, Chakotay, Executive Director of National Heritage and Conservation in Zambia, argued that the skull was his country's indigenous and earliest hominin find, and that its removal had been carried out under colonial conditions that made any claim of legitimate donation legally and morally questionable. 15 of the 22 member states present supported Zambia's bid. The committee recommended that Britain and Zambia report back with progress by 2024. In 2024, the recommendation deadline arrived. The skull remained in London. Britain had agreed to negotiate the possible relocation of the fossil, but had not agreed to return it. Some researchers who have spent their careers studying the skull argue that certain conditions should be met before repatriation: comprehensive CT scanning at the highest possible resolution, full digital documentation, and agreements guaranteeing ongoing scientific access, not as preconditions to delay the return indefinitely, but as practical measures to protect the research value of an object that has already contributed enormously to science and has more to give. Others argue that these conditions amount to another form of colonial gatekeeping, that Zambia is perfectly capable of housing and protecting its own heritage, and that the moral case for return is not weakened by the scientific value of continued British custody. What is not disputed is that the skull was removed from African soil under colonial authority, without consent from the people of the region, at a time when the concept of Zambian cultural sovereignty did not legally exist, and that it has been held in London for over a century while the country that produced it repeatedly and formally asked for it back. That context is inseparable from the scientific story of what the skull means. Because the Kabwe skull is not just a fossil. It is the first ancient hominin fossil ever found in Africa. It was found at a moment in 1921 when most Western scientists were still looking to Asia or Europe for the origin of our species, when Africa's role in human evolution was either dismissed or minimized by a scientific establishment that was not culturally prepared to accept the implications of African primacy in the human story. The skull from the mine in Zambia was, in that context, a foundational piece of evidence that Africa had been central to human evolution all along, and it was immediately shipped to London. Return now to what the science actually says, because the implication of the 299,000-year age estimate goes much further than the simple fact of three species coexisting. It reaches into the foundations of the single origin model and begins to pull at threads that, once pulled, reveal something more complicated and ultimately more interesting than the clean story that the textbooks have been telling. The single origin model assumed that Homo sapiens emerged in one specific region of Africa from one founding population, and that all subsequent human diversity descended from that single source. The evidence that has accumulated in the past decade, much of it from ancient DNA, but supported by fossil finds, like the Kabwe skull's new age estimate, is increasingly inconsistent with that assumption. What is replacing it is something called the structured population model, or Pan-African origin model, the idea that Homo sapiens did not emerge from a single ancestral group in a single location, but from multiple interacting populations distributed across the African continent, each contributing to the emerging human genome through a complex web of migration, contact, separation, and gene flow that played out over hundreds of thousands of years. The fossil record increasingly supports this picture. The Jebel Irhoud fossils from Morocco, dated to approximately 300,000 years ago, show a mosaic of features, modern facial structure combined with a more primitive, elongated brain case that looks like a transitional form rather than a finished product. The Florisbad skull from South Africa, roughly 260,000 years old, shows different modern features combined with other primitive ones. The Omo Kibish fossils from Ethiopia, dated to approximately 195,000 years ago, look more fully modern. These are not a single population at different stages of development. They are different populations in different parts of Africa, each carrying a different combination of modern and archaic features, each contributing something to the eventual emergence of anatomically modern humans across the whole continent. And then there is Homo naledi, which adds the most disturbing dimension to this picture. Homo naledi was first announced to the world in 2015, based on remains excavated from the Rising Star Cave system near Johannesburg by a team led by paleoanthropologist Lee Berger. The species has a brain roughly one-third the size of a modern human brain. Its hands and feet show features suited to tree climbing. Its skeletal proportions are a mosaic of primitive and modern characteristics that do not fit comfortably anywhere in the standard evolutionary sequence. When it was first described, researchers assumed it must be very old, perhaps 2 million years, because its primitive features seemed to place it early in the hominin lineage. Then came the dating results. Homo naledi lived between approximately 236,000 and 335,000 years ago, contemporary with the Kabwe skull, contemporary with the earliest Homo sapiens. A small-brained, partly arboreal, anatomically peculiar hominin species was roaming the caves of South Africa, at the same time that anatomically modern humans were walking the landscapes of Morocco and Ethiopia, and South Central Africa was hosting whatever population the Kabwe individual belonged to. Even more unsettling for the tidy narrative of human evolution, Homo naledi appears to have engaged in a behavior that was previously assumed to be exclusive to anatomically modern humans. The remains found in the Rising Star cave system were not deposited there by carnivores or by accidental death. The patterns of skeletal distribution, the inaccessibility of the chambers, and the absence of evidence for any other depositional mechanism have led researchers to conclude that Homo naledi was deliberately placing its dead in a specific location inside the cave system. A species with a brain the size of an orange, in the same country, in the same geological moment as the earliest Homo sapiens, was practicing something that looked functionally like intentional burial. The paper published in eLife in 2017 that described this finding was explicit about its implications. Modern Homo sapiens, it noted, is a phylogenetic relict, a species that survives from a clade that was once far more diverse. We are the last of a much larger family. The genetic evidence for this goes beyond the fossils. Studies of living African populations have found statistical signals in the genomes of certain West African groups that suggest ancient gene flow from a population of archaic humans who were genetically as divergent from modern humans as the Neanderthals were, but who have left no fossil record that has yet been found. Ghost populations, leaving their trace only in the DNA of the living descendants of the people who once interbred with them, which raises the possibility, not proven but scientifically legitimate, that the Kabwe individual's lineage, Homo heidelbergensis, did not simply go extinct without contributing to the modern human genome. If anatomically modern humans and Homo heidelbergensis were living on the same continent simultaneously for tens of thousands of years, the likelihood of some degree of interbreeding between them is not negligible. Around 300,000 years ago, multiple hominin species coexisted in Africa. The data increasingly suggests that those species were not hermetically sealed from one another. They met, and when closely related species that are capable of reproduction meet repeatedly over millennia, the boundaries between them are not as absolute as the textbook diagrams suggest. The human story, as the Kabwe skull in its true age reveals it, is not a tree with a single trunk. It is something more like a braided river, multiple channels running in the same general direction, periodically merging and diverging, carrying sediment from sources distributed across a whole continent, and eventually converging into a single main channel that is made up of contributions from all of them. That picture is harder to teach than the single origin model. It is less satisfying as a narrative. It does not give you a single founding moment or a single founding place or a single ancestral population that you can point to and say, there, that is where we began. Instead, it gives you a continent full of related but distinct populations, mixing and diverging across hundreds of thousands of years, each contributing partial pieces of what would eventually become the biological and cognitive profile of Homo sapiens. It is messier and more ambiguous and more resistant to reduction into a paragraph or a diagram. It is also almost certainly closer to the truth. The Kabwe skull still sits in London. The mine that produced it is gone, quarried into oblivion long ago, the geological context that could have answered 100 more questions about the individual and the community it belonged to, destroyed before any scientist could record it. The town of Kabwe, which still bears the name associated with the skull, is now considered one of the most polluted places on Earth, the legacy of a century of lead and zinc mining that left the soil and the water and the blood of its children contaminated with heavy metals that the mining companies no longer around to clean up. The skull survived. It is one of the best preserved hominin fossils ever recovered from any site anywhere in the world. Its brow ridges are intact. Its dental record survives. Its mysterious circular hole is still there, still unexplained to everyone's complete satisfaction, still generating arguments about pathology and violence and the long reach of speculation across 300,000 years. And the dating study that finally told us how old it is generated findings that the field has not finished processing. Because what it implied, 3 human species on one continent at one time, the single origin model under pressure from multiple directions simultaneously, the human past, more tangled and more plural and more African than any clean narrative has ever captured, is a picture that takes time to fully absorb. Every year, new ancient DNA is extracted from new ancient bones in new locations across Africa. Every year, that DNA adds resolution to a picture that gets more complicated rather than simpler as the resolution increases. Every year, the story of where we came from grows less like a straight line and more like the continent it began on, vast, varied, ancient, beyond ordinary comprehension, and full of things we have not yet found. The miner who found that skull in 1921 handed it to officials who sent it to London. 100 years later, Zambia is still asking for it back. The science that the skull has generated is still being written. And somewhere in the red soils of the Zambian plateau, in sites that have not yet been excavated, under the surface of a landscape that holds more human history than any other place on Earth, there are bones still waiting to be found that will add another layer to a story that has been unfolding for 300,000 years and shows no sign of being finished.